now, analysis. The Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Margaret Thatcher MP, in conversation with Michael Charlton.
Prime Minister, you are this unique figure, the country's first woman Prime Minister, determined, as you've said, to buck the trends of the past 20 years. What's this 18 months in Downing Street told you or taught you about the governing of Britain?
What a very difficult question to start with. A good deal, I think. The policies we're following are not novel in any way. Indeed, I might almost call them traditional, because they're those very policies which made such a success in Germany, made such a success in Switzerland. They're policies which say you cannot run a government on spending more than the nation earns and printing the difference. Now, in a way, that's what we've been doing for a long, long time. We've just paid ourselves more, regardless of whether we've produced it. Other nations have only paid themselves more when the pay's been warranted by greater output. So they're doing better than we are, and they'll ride a recession more easily.
But what's the experience told you, would you say, about what you believe now to be possible as a result of these 18 months in Downing Street, as opposed to what you think and believe to be necessary?
I think two things. First, the main oil price increase hit us after we came in, and that, of course, has brought on a much, much deeper world recession, which is affecting us and every other industrialized country. So that's one of the problems. But the other thing is that I know that we have to go on absolutely with the policy which we came in with, because in the midst of a world recession, it's absolutely vital that we get British industry into an efficient shape so that we can take advantage of the expansion. And in a way, we have more hope of the expansion then than other countries.
But
for the simple reason that alone among the industrialized countries, we're self-sufficient in energy. So if we get our industry into a really efficient shape, only taking out more in pay when they put in more in output, with a background of security of oil supply, we have more hope of a brighter future than almost any other industrialized country.
But that's what you believe to be necessary. As you sit here measuring the responses this country has been making to you month by month, as you sit here in Downing Street, what reinforces your convictions, or have they been altered, as to whether this country wants a more leisured, less aggressive form of life, or whether it is willing to undertake the fundamental changes you think it should?
Oh, but I think it is willing to undertake them. And I think one of the great things is that attitudes are changing. Look, I haven't brought in any statutory incomes policy or anything like that. And yet the whole of the pay claims in the private sector are going down. And they're going down because the people who work in those industries and those service industries are realizing that unless, in fact, they bring them down, then they'll price themselves out of jobs. Of course it is taking just a little bit of time, and it will. Just let me point out one thing. Michael Edwards, whom we all think is a terrific guy, has been at British Leyland 3 years. He hasn't turned British Leyland round completely yet, but he's doing well. I've been here 18 months. I haven't turned the whole of Britain round yet, but we are going steadily to doing it. Those attitudes are changing. The number of strikes is right down. Exports have held up well. Our trade is right in the black. Our currency is right up. That's very, very, very different from 18 months out of the last Labour government, when we really were in acute difficulty. Mind you, let me point out there's one very great difference. They started on a base of 600,000 unemployed. That's what we left them with. And it went up, as you know, under them to 1.6 million unemployed. Now, they left me with a base of 1.4 million unemployed. And if only they'd left me with the sort of much lower base that they'd started with, we'd not have the problems with unemployment that we do now.
But why should your supporters leave on one side for the moment those who are opposed to what you stand for? Why should your supporters not feel uneasy, downhearted, perhaps even demoralized, when they see that your government has just made its 5th intervention in the economy in 18 months, yet another revision of policies and forecasts, another government blown off course in the manner of its predecessors who you've criticized so much?
No, we're not blown off course at all. Of course, if you're going from A to B, You don't always necessarily go on a total straight line. There are sometimes obstacles in your way, and you might just have to deviate just a little bit. But not blown off course in any way. There have been things which have been greater than we'd expected. One, of course, is the oil price increase of 100%. That is an enormous one. The other is that we've had to face massive bills in the public sector. Perhaps the best way I can express it is that if you look over the last 2 years, the total pay bill for the total public sector is 50% more than it was 2 years ago. Now, you may say we ought not to have done it. But you know, when we fought that election, many and many a group was saying to us, look, the last Labour government's given us 9% and referred us to Clegg, or we've got a comparability award coming up. Will you honour it? And we said yes. Now, we've had to pick up all of those blank cheques left to us by Mr. Callaghan and the Labour government. They have put an enormous burden on the taxpayer and the ratepayer, because that's where we get it from. Now, that period is through. The public sector has done, I think, very well in the last 18 months.
That, if I may say so,
right up to the private sector, right up. And now we have a different base from which to go forward. But that enormous increase now is behind us. And that's why we're saying we simply cannot go on paying the public sector more and more and more, because the private sector, who has to find the money, can't bear it.
But that, if I may say so, is a criticism of you, isn't it? That you accepted obligations which were fundamentally incompatible with the policies. Why did you accept what Professor Clegg's huge award in the public sector meant, over £1 billion, and at the same time promise people that you would have the economy on course as quickly as you did?
Oh, I don't think anyone ever suggested we'd have the economy on course in 18 months. Far, far from it. You know that when you're trying to get public spending down, it is a much, much more difficult and longer process. I say we've been here 18 months. But there was, you know, very considerable resentment in some of the public services that they weren't getting a fair deal compared with the private sector. We had, in fact, therefore, to honour the Clegg Awards and to try to get rid of that resentment, because, you know, it is very important that we have efficient public services. They've got their pay up, and we're now steadily improving efficiency. The numbers employed in civil service are coming down. They're down by about 35,000 since we came in. At last, numbers in local government are coming down to put up efficiency, and we have to go further. But there's a great deal we've got behind us now. First, we took down the direct rate of income tax by the biggest amount ever in Geoffrey Howe's first budget. Income tax down from 33 pence in the pound to 30. Thresholds for taxation greatly improved. Improvements on tax on savings. I think people tend to have forgotten
yes,
that.
but in the public mind,
the
consequence in the public mind is that they see Sir Geoffrey Howe coming back into the House of Commons as often as Mr. Healy did.
No, that just
so
is
their
not
promise
quite
is
right.
that you shouldn't really have made, is the argument. But
no.
Could I move on to this question of the money supply?
It is not. He had his first budget, then he had his second, and now what he's having to do is he has not announced major budget changes. What he's had to do is announce changes which he wants to take effect from next April. And if you have to do the national insurance contribution, it is always done at this time of year. And may I just make one point about that? We simply cannot say as a nation that we want our retirement pensioners to have more, we want our sick people to have more, and then deny the means to give them more. And that's why the national insurance contribution had to go up, because really the greater part of the contributions are paid out in increased retirement pensions.
You've made control of the money supply in the public mind the absolute heart and soul of your policy. Now, how do you think people should view those figures and the facts of recent months, that the forecasts you made only 9 months ago have been out by almost 100%? Now, surely you would expect public confidence in your own belief in this instrument as an infallible corrective to the economy to be misplaced.
No, I don't think so. For 4 or 5 months, we got that money supply right down to within the target. Then we decided that we really must take off the Bank of England corset. Perhaps we ought to have taken it off previously, because it distorted what was happening. After all, the corset is supposed to conceal the underlying position, and of course it did. That's what it's for. So we took it off. Give us credit for saying, look, we've jolly well got to know what's happening. And when we took it off, and don't forget, Dennis Healy put it on in 1978. We took it off. and we found out what was happening.
But even
The
allowing
position
for that,
is-
it's still twice as much as you forecast.
Even allowing for that, it is extremely worrying at the moment. I accept that. And it's not made any easier by the fact that we're getting money in from overseas, and it's much, much more difficult to keep the money supply under control, ironically enough, when you've got a good balance of payments, which we have. But I believe it will come back on target. I don't believe it will be back by next April. But we will keep it back on target, and this is one of the reasons why we couldn't take interest rates down before we did.
Does it
But
still
I
have
believe
this-
it will come
does
back, but at least give us credit for this. We've taken off all the mechanisms which would lead to false figures. We now know exactly what it is, and we're going to steadily get it back, do it right on course.
So it still has the same priority and emphasis in your own mind
Oh,
as it
indeed,
had.
yes. Oh, indeed, yes.
Sir Keith Joseph says the government has lost the first year. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that, but I do think that I know what Keith is trying to get at. He thinks that we'd not have anything like the present difficulties if we'd managed to get public spending down more. In a way, it's the other side of the coin. You've been arguing about public service pay, because that is one of the biggest factors in public expenditure. And Keith knows, and I know, that had we got that public spending down more, the money supply would have come down faster. But above all, which he is worried about and I am, there'd been less money in public sector and more money in the private sector. When you come to look at where do we get it down, you see, and every time I come back to this, the big spenders are defense, education, health, and social security. Now, as you know, we came in and we agreed to put up defense spending because we thought it was necessary, so that was an extra impost on people's earnings. Health we've kept, absolutely, because we thought it was vital that the nation's health be all right. Social security increases. So we have not been as successful as we'd hoped in getting down the level of public spending.
A very wide public impression, I think, has been created, Prime Minister, that the recent 5 cabinet meetings over this issue represented, in the outcome of them, a defeat for you personally, that you, like Sir Keith Joseph, stood wholeheartedly on one side of that argument, that you agreed with him, that you thought there should be more cuts in order to make this policy work. Now, is that a correct impression?
No, it is not a correct impression. The purpose of those cabinet meetings was certainly to try to get down public spending, and after all, we did get it down by $1 billion, which when you add to our success in negotiating with Europe, that we're going to get about 650 million back there, means that we've got the total down, the total commitments down by 1.6 billion. That's not bad. That's quite good. We then said it's not good enough because we're still borrowing more than we should. And that means we've got to put up national insurance contributions if we're to keep the outgoings. Now, that wasn't a weak decision.
So
that was a strong decision.
We should see you in this cabinet as rather more neutral on this issue of public expenditure cuts than you've been representing.
No, you should not see him as neutral at all.
But did you want twice
know.
twice as much as the Treasury got?
Well, we had to look. It's no good wanting twice as much unless you actually look to see where it's going to come from. And if you can't get more, then you have to say, well, I'm not prepared to borrow it because that will get interest rates up even higher. So we must, in fact, take in more, particularly if we're to carry on paying out pensions, sickness benefit, invalidity benefit, on the increased rates which we have agreed. But it really was realism. And the Cabinet was absolutely united, and we got a realistic decision through. Some increase in contributions, some considerable reductions in public spending. And if you add it to the reductions that we've made previously, it is a very considerable bill.
But is the price of unity in the Cabinet unity around something which is not strictly what is held to be a successful monetary policy? Can I put to you what the apostles of monetary policy, who have thought or are thought publicly to have had a considerable influence upon you, Milton Friedman and Professor Hayek, have both criticized the steps you've taken over public expenditure, and they've distanced themselves from you in the press publicly. Friedman has said it's too little, too late. And Hayek says, no inflation has been terminated without a stabilization crisis. To believe it can be slowed down gradually over a period means accepting prolonged misery. No government can stand a course of prolonged misery. If we want to stop inflation, we must do it here and now. Now, isn't that what Joseph means when he says that you've lost the first year? You've prolonged the misery.
Oh, but let me just take up Professor Hayek, for whom I have the highest possible regard. But inflation is coming down, and it's coming down very sharply indeed. Yes, there were increases in the pipeline when I took over. Gas and electricity had been referred to the Prices Commission, and I had to take the increase in prices there. Milk price increases had been delayed. I had to take those. But inflation is coming down. It's coming down because we followed two very strict policies. One, a strict monetary policy, backed up by very considerable reductions in public expenditure. And if you add them all up, they are considerable reductions, cumulatively, over the 5 years. And they have been successful. Inflation is coming down. All right, it's still 15.3% over an annual period. But in the last 6 months, the reduction has been very, very sharp indeed.
But if it's going to take...
And they know that it's been successful. So they're criticizing me on one of the things that really has been very successful, and people's expectations are that it will fall and fall considerably in the coming year. So, look, just acknowledge what has been done.
But can you tell people the worst, Mrs. Thatcher? Your government's presided over an unprecedented fall in the output of our factories, and the image is being created in people's minds, and the comparisons are directly being made with the 1930s, which the figures so closely resemble. Now, can you tell people the worst? What should they prepare for? Can you say that unemployment will not go to 3 million before you get this right?
I have never made forecasts about unemployment. We have to give the government actual forecasts, assumptions really, for the fund for the coming year. But let me take you up immediately. You make a parallel with the 1930s. There is no such parallel. In the 1930s, there were only 18 million people in work. Today, there are over 24.5 million people in work. Enormously different. In the 1930s, there was not a system of social security of the kind we have now. We have an excellent system of social security now. And one of the prices you have to pay for getting an economy right, which has been overmanned and not efficient, is by reducing that overmanning, you do get increases in unemployment. But let me say what I said to you earlier. Had we been left with a base level of unemployment of 600,000, namely what the Labour government started with, we'd not have figures of unemployment of the kind now that we have. You know and I know that steadily in the last 20 years, the unemployed levels have risen over every trade cycle, and they will go on rising unless we get our industry efficient and competitive with other people's.
But can you address yourself directly to the growing number of unemployed in this country?
Yes, I can.
This is frightening and demoralizing people. What do you say to them? When is the turning point, in your own judgment? I know governments don't like making forecasts, but what to them are going to be the first signals in this country of positive recovery?
Well, your inflation is going down. That is always the first signal of return of confidence. As inflation goes down, so you can take your interest rates down. As your interest rates go down, so people will probably start rebuilding their stocks and start investment again. As interest rates go down, so more businesses can start up. Your improvement comes from starting up more small businesses. It has always come that way in the United States and on the continent, and it will here. We believe, as Geoffrey Howe said the other day, that we're reaching the trough of the recession, and it will start to turn up towards the end of next year. It takes longer to reduce your unemployment, for the simple reason that people can always be more efficient than they are on the number of people they have now. That applies particularly in this country, because you look at the figures, for example, for car production. Look at the figures for Fords. You know that in Germany there are Ford factories, the same machinery, producing the same cars, but one man produces twice as many cars as is produced in Britain. And of course, so long as we have that, we shall not be competitive. And so we get imports of cars. We've got to deal with that before we're competitive. But I do believe we're approaching the trough of the recession, and by the end of next year, we shall see improvements.
So Geoffrey Howe said in the House the other day there was justified concern that this country was in danger of becoming two nations. You won the election south of a line drawn across the middle of the country rather than north of it. What do you say directly now to people in these old industrial areas of this country where the greatest hardships are being sustained, and where, if you won't accept the comparisons of the 1930s, if you reject them, they must prepare for something worse?
Those parts of the country that depend heavily on some of the old industries are suffering Please let me make that immediately clear. I remember when I went up to Sunderland and I went round the big Austin Pickersgill shipyards, what they said to me was, please send Inmos up here and don't have it in the south. And certainly there are very real problems there, and we have to try to get more jobs there. But after all, this is why we have a regional policy and why we do have more support for industries wishing to go to those regions, and why we have put more into special development areas so that we can concentrate on those and less into some of the other areas. One thing strikes me very much. Some of those areas depend on steel, shipbuilding, cars, engineering. Now, one of the difficult reasons why we're in such difficulty, for example, with steel, is that we've lost a lot of the market in cars in Britain. We haven't lost the demand. The demand for cars is still here. That demand is being satisfied by people buying overseas products, and that is the tragedy of Britain. Those who are earning their money here are rejecting the products of some of their fellow workers. When you have car demand being satisfied from abroad, it means you're not only importing foreign cars, you're importing foreign steel, and that rebounds on your steel industry. Our share of shipbuilding has really gone down in previous years because other people have proved themselves more efficient. That rebounds not only on shipbuilding, but also on steel, because we're not producing the ships, so we're not ordering the steel. The third thing is, you go around almost every factory, and I always look to see where the equipment comes from. Now, in some things in engineering we're marvelous, but so much of the highly complex machinery comes from the United States, from Germany, from Switzerland. And there, we're not ordering our own machinery and equipment. That's an import of steel. We always come back to the same point, and that is why I have to continue to be tough. Britain will not be prosperous until her industries are efficient, and there's only one way to produce goods which people want at a price they're prepared to pay and at a delivery upon which they can rely.
But in the reduction of the minimum lending rate, I mean, people do not see you as tough. They see you as having given way, perhaps, because the path that you would like to pursue has proved not politically sustainable, that you've jumped the gun, that you've made the reduction in anticipation of achievements rather than achievements which have been made.
I would not have reduced that minimum lending rate if I didn't think it was justified. And therefore, one of the things I had to do before announcing a reduction was to get an announced reduction in public spending. We did. It was also, insofar as we could not get reductions further, I had to cover it by increases in national insurance contribution and to try to cover some of the increases in national health.
It's not in your own mind. It's not a gamble.
It is not a gamble. Increase in the National Health Service also by increases in contributions. I had to go for the borrowing. The third factor is inflation is coming down and rapidly. And if you look at the figures for the last 6 months, inflation in the last 6 months has only been up by about 4.5%. Well, you take an interest rate of 14% against that. It is very positive indeed. Further, the interest rates in the market was coming down, and I don't believe that a reduction from 16 to 14% is going to encourage firms to dash in to borrow more. I don't think it'll make that much difference to the amount they are borrowing.
Mrs. Thatcher, looking outside Britain for a moment, what's made it possible or necessary for the government to turn over a new leaf, as it obviously has in the speeches you and Lord Carrington have been making recently, in Europe?
Turn over a new leaf? We are just playing now a very full part in Europe. And the reason we're able to do so is because we have managed to get agreement on some of the things which were causing acute resentment in Britain. The agreement on the budget was really a very good one. As I mentioned earlier this year, this financial year, we shall get back some £650 million. A very large amount. Heaven knows we need it. So we've got rid of that resentment that we were paying far too large a proportion of Europe's budget. The moment we got rid of that one, other things began to move. We got a very good agreement on lamb sales and support prices for lamb. We're now going for complete agreement on fishing. Heaven knows, all the time we've been in Europe,
Are you going to get it?
we've not got an agreement on fishing. And if we don't get one, then other countries in Europe will be entitled to fish right up to our coast by 1982. And I believe we shall get a satisfactory agreement. But the real things causing resentment have gone, and so we're able to take a much fuller part in Europe. And, of course, our reputation abroad is very, very high. And it is high because we have been financially tough and are still being financially tough.
Well, the British are often criticised, aren't they, for not having a vision of Europe, of knowing what it is we want there, that we see it in terms of butter mountains and wine lakes rather than the wider issue. What is your own vision with these obstacles having been removed, as you see it? What is your own vision of Britain in the European community?
I don't think you can have a vision in the sense that you can say that in 20 years' time we shall be in a certain place. I have always seen Europe as a Europe of nations that cooperate more and more closely together, that cooperate more and more closely together on trade, that negotiate together with the rest of the world on trade because we're stronger when we do so, and that we have free trade among ourselves. And that, you know, to a nation who is steadily improving its industry should be of tremendous advantage and tremendous benefit. But I don't think you can say that we're going to have totally different political structures in 20 years' time. Europe will have to evolve. And I think if we go on steadily cooperating, dealing with the problems together, there's been a very good example recently. Steel. The whole of Europe has overproduction of steel. Not only us, but other countries as well. So we had to get together, because if one country reduces its steel and the increase is just taken up by another, then naturally we would feel great resentment if we'd reduced our steel and Europe not theirs. So we've agreed quotas, and I believe that that will be very beneficial to the steel industry of Europe as a whole, and will be fair and equitable and just. That's very good. We couldn't have done it unless we'd been in Europe. So there are really a number of tremendous advantages to our industrial benefit by belonging to Europe.
What trends there do we wish to reinforce? Lord Carrington recently in Hamburg lamented that Europe was unable to take political initiatives, and he specifically mentioned of the kind that the Americans, for example, had taken in the Middle East at Camp David. Now, the inference of that would appear to be that Britain foresees the need for the European community to take some initiative between the Arabs and the Jews to try and get a settlement of this dispute in an area which is so vital to us because of oil and other things. Do you see a direct link between those two things?
Well, we were, as you know, at the Venice summit trying to do something to help to try to solve the Middle Eastern problem, in particular during the period of the United States election. But more than that, we felt in Europe that we've been using certain general phrases for a very long time. Self-determination, a home for the people who have aspirations, the Palestinian people who have legitimate aspirations to a home of their own. There was the 242 United Nations resolution, withdrawal behind secure boundaries. All of these general phrases had been going on for ages. And no one had said, look, what do they mean in practical terms? And we in Europe have been trying to work that out in practical terms. And one of the objects during these past few months and these coming few months is to try to go around to all of the parties concerned and say, look, exactly what is meant by self-determination. Don't forget that the West Bank used to belong to Jordan. What do we mean by self-determination? How would it be brought about? How would you get security for Israel? Because you're not going to get anywhere unless you have security for Israel and unless you get some place for the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. But we've talked in these generalizations long enough. We've got to get practical propositions, and that's what Europe is trying to do.
Do you think Mr. Foot's election as leader of the Labour Party will make any practical difference over the European issue, that it's going to make it harder for you to mobilize by partisanship, which have always been thought to be the foundations of a successful external policy? Will it modify what you can do or hope to achieve in Europe?
I think that some of our partners were very, very worried by what he and the Labour Party said. And it is really doubly ridiculous, because just as we've got rid of most of our legitimate complaints about the budget and about various other things, just as the whole of Europe is restructuring the budget, is having a new look at the common agricultural policy, just as we really are benefiting from trade agreements which the whole of Europe can sign, just at that moment the Labour Party says pull out. The effect on jobs in Britain, I believe, would be disastrous, because now about 45% of our trade is with Europe. And the effect and the irresponsibility of saying pull out would really be catastrophic on some of our areas who rely on exports to Europe for their jobs. And Europe is very, very worried about it. I've said, please don't be too worried about it, because I don't believe that the Labour Party will get into power to carry that out. And one hopes to influence them during the time on the basis of jobs and trade alone, if for nothing else.
And you have a new president of the United States with whom you will shortly have to work, Mr. Reagan. Do you think it's likely that he will want the Europeans, including Britain, to do more about defence?
We have been doing more about defence. During our first year, we increased defence expenditure by 3%. This year, we might reach 3%. I'm not quite sure. We'll certainly go over 2.5%. And next year, probably about the same. We cannot just go on and on increasing defence expenditure regardless of the underlying state of the economy. And as you know, the NATO pledge took into account the underlying state of the economy and said that if the economy was not sufficiently good to enable the 3% to happen, that must be something that we would take into account. I'm naturally anxious to spend more on defence, because I think the Western world needs to be strong to negotiate properly and fully with the Soviet Union. But you know, we're taking the same attitude as our other partners, and we're all, or many of us, wish to spend more to keep the NATO alliance in full health and strength. But
there's another of the promises.
We must get the economy right.
But there's another of the election promises that you've had to break, isn't it? That
No,
you've been cutting
isn't.
defence expenditure, not increasing it.
I'm very sorry. We have not cut defence expenditure. The first year, we increased it in real terms by 3%. This year, we may touch 3%, but we'll certainly touch 2.5%. Next year will be an increase in expenditure in real terms over this year. And I really do get very, very angry when people accuse us of cutting when we've actually been increasing. Defence expenditure has been increasing. I do wish people would look properly at the figures. What I've been trying to do on this whole public expenditure exercise is not to cut in total, but to hold the levels of public expenditure from going up at a time when I believe the private sector could not afford more.
But as you've said, you're not sure if you'll meet the target which you undertook to meet of 3% for NATO. Do you think that in the light of the recession, to which you've drawn attention, I mean, not everybody knew that the Ayatollah would have the effect that he had when these obligations were undertaken. Do you think that NATO's targets of 3% increases should be reviewed in the light of the recession?
But the NATO promise, just let me read it out, to aim at making available resources which would allow for annual increases of defence spending in the region of 3% in real terms, recognizing that for some individual countries, economic circumstances would affect what could be achieved. That was the NATO promise. We did 3% in our first year. We shall do at least 2.5% this year. It may be 3%. We shall spend more next year than this year. That is fully in accord with our promise of in the region of 3% in real terms, recognizing that economic circumstances would affect what could be achieved. We're absolutely in accord with that promise, and we're doing a good deal more than some of our NATO partners.
Are you doing enough, though, to meet the threat?
The threat we have to meet together. Don't forget that in the whole of the Western world, the whole of the standard of living and the gross national product is very much higher than it is in the Warsaw Pact countries. And between us, I believe, we're spending more than the whole of the Warsaw Pact countries, although in terms of what they spend as a percentage of their output, theirs is going up. And ours, well, we shall have to get our GDP up.
Would you swap the defense forces of the West for those of the Soviet Union?
Never.
How do you see this?
Never, never, never.
How do you see the sequel, Mrs. Thatcher, to what happened in Afghanistan? Would you say that it has made the Russians more or less cautious about events in Poland?
I think it has made them more cautious, because I think the reaction of the whole world to their invasion of Afghanistan, an independent country, surprised them. Not only the action of the Western world, the reaction of the Western world, but the reaction of the non-aligned countries, and recently, as you know, in the United Nations, 111 nations voted whereas previously it had only been 104, voted against the continued occupation of Afghanistan. And I think that really was quite an eye-opener to the Russians. They thought they would get away with it. They thought that the whole of the world would come to accept it. We haven't.
The campaign for nuclear disarmament appears to have a new lease of life in this country, with a very large demonstration which drew a lot of attention and comment in London. Do you think that you're going to have a battle on your hands in mobilizing support for the nuclear deterrent policy?
No, I do not. Surely we've learned the lesson that the only way to tackle and to negotiate with a strong country is to be strong yourself. The only way to deal with them is to be able to deter them at each and every level, the nuclear level and the conventional level. And unless you do, you lay yourself open to having to give in to almost every threat they make, because you just haven't the means to resist. My generation learned that you never, never appease. And I am appalled that the Labour Party, with its unilateral disarmament on nuclear, seems to have become the new arch-appeaser of this period. So many of them were against appeasement in the 30s, although they weren't in fact voting for the increase in defence expenditure, and they weren't voting for the necessary conscription even in the early stage of 1939. But surely we've learned a lesson. Never let us go that way again. Unilateralism, no. Strength, yes.
But are the unilateralists nonetheless in a stronger position in this country now than they were in 1960 with Mr. Foote as leader of the Labour Party?
I don't believe that the majority of the people in this country wish to have a weak Britain who has to negotiate from fear.
But Mr. Foote says that he intends to move this issue to the centre of the stage in Britain. If Mr. Foote wishes to do that, I shall fight him with all my strength. The idea that a leader of the opposition or a main party in Britain is going to put this country in a position where she can never negotiate from strength, but has to give in from fear, and then hide behind the skirts of the United States, who will have nuclear power, hide behind their skirts and not play our full part, is to me appalling. I think the Labour Party would do a jolly sight better if they were to say to the Soviet Union, you've got these enormous SS-20s targeted on Europe. You're ahead in your nuclear armament on those nuclear weapons. You refuse to make any more, and then we needn't. But they really ought to attack those who've got these enormous weapons targeted on Europe, for which we have not yet got a proper reply. Why don't they direct their whole argument to the Soviet Union and say, you stop making those, and then we, in fact, needn't make extra ourselves? Closer to home, Prime Minister, in Northern Ireland, with the failure of yet another initiative, what's next?
Northern Ireland is one of the very, very great, historically difficult problems. We had a political initiative. It did not, in fact, find acceptance among the peoples of Northern Ireland. And we just have to go on trying to find another way, trying to work together more and more, the two communities, and trying to live together. It is, I think, one of the biggest disappointments to most of us, that when you've had the, grievous things that have taken place there in the last 10 years, that the people themselves haven't said, look, enough. Let's try to find a way of living together better.
You said recently you
haven't, and so we shall have to go on with a direct rule until we do.
But you said recently you wouldn't allow Northern Ireland's political parties to block your political initiative, which they appear to have done. This initiative which envisaged the return of some powers to the province. I mean, is the inference that you do intend in the end to impose a solution now?
No, we'll have to go on at the moment with direct rule, which seems to be working as well as any possible alternative, indeed I think better than any alternative that we've been able to put. But all the time trying to involve the people of Northern Ireland more. There are a large number of advisory groups to advise the Secretary of State on how to discharge his responsibilities. And we will just go on trying. It is the only thing we can do.
You've said that you won't be deflected by the hunger strike of IRA prisoners or the prospect of their deaths if they choose to end their lives in this manner. As a result of your recent visit to the Pope, what view do you think that they, the hunger strikers, and all Irishmen, will be invited to take?
Well, you remember that the Pope, when he visited Southern Ireland, was very forthright in what he said against violence. Those hunger strikers have gone on hunger strike because they want political status. I have said and will continue to say and will continue to hold firm, there is no such thing as political murder. I cannot interfere with a hunger strike. We do not force feed. If those people continue with their hunger strike, it will have no effect whatsoever. It will just take their own lives, for which I shall be profoundly sorry, because I think it's a ridiculous thing to do. I think it's a ridiculous way to try to go about it. Before the hunger strike started, we had a look at the rules affecting all prisoners in Northern Ireland, and we decided that instead of wearing prison uniform, they could in fact have an issue of civilian type clothes chosen by the Northern Irish authorities. That happens in a number of other countries. Having said that, I thought we got ourselves into a really good position, and there will be and can be no concessions. That hunger strike will do no good at all. It will not achieve any objectives which help the people of Northern Ireland, and I shall not move from my total belief and commitment that murder is murder, and it is a criminal crime which these people choose to do, and for which they are totally and utterly personally responsible.
And lastly, Prime Minister, the other day in a speech about inflation, you invoked the memory of the first Queen Elizabeth and her battle with inflation. Now, even though, like her, you're a weak and feeble woman, and you've told us you have the heart and stomach to maintain, though, your chosen path, what convincing answer would you like to give, for example, to Sir Harold Wilson, who believes that in 3 years, this is what he's forecast, you'll be replaced, that the Conservative Party will just remove you, and that the seas will close over you?
I shall carry on with what I believe to be totally right. These are the policies which have been successful elsewhere. I am here to do what I believe to be right. But Mr. Charlton, attitudes are changing. Trade unions and their members are acknowledging that pay increases have to be earned. Exports have done well, despite the pound strength, and it's far better to have a strong pound than the collapsing pound which we had under Sir Harold Wilson and Mr. Callaghan. The balance of trade is good. The number of strikes have fallen dramatically. We have got inflation right down. And when we've achieved, we've not got inflation right down yet, we have got inflation down. It's my objective to get it right down. We shall in future see a real revival of our country's fortunes if we hold to the path that we're on now.
Queen Elizabeth said it on the approach of the Armada, if you remember, to her troops at Tilbury. Do you maintain your chosen path on the approach of very high levels of unemployment in Britain?
She also, the quotation which I used was the one where she said that when you've got tremendous inflation, and you remember, she was restoring the value of the coinage when she said it, that yes, it will cause pain, but it's really like taking a medicine. There are times when even the medicine causes you pain to take, but the taking of it is the very thing that will restore you to health and strength again. And you don't, if you're in severe illness or severe difficulty, stop taking the medicine. You go on taking it until it's had its effect and you are restored to health and strength. That happened under the first Queen Elizabeth as inflation was ended. I believe that it will happen under us when we've got inflation further down and when people condition what they take out to the extra output they put in.
Prime Minister, thank you.
The Right Honourable Margaret Thatcher MP was in conversation with Michael Charlton. The producer was Caroline Thompson. Extracts from tonight's programme will appear in next week's The Listener, which is out tomorrow week on December the 4th. And next week's analysis will be looking at the way Israel sees the changing situation in the Middle East when John Eidenauer presents Israel, the Frontiers of Peace.